Hello, and welcome to another session of Sinai Speaks, where we get to learn and think and connect together, sometimes in person, sometimes online, as in this case, but always as one community. We are incredibly fortunate to have with us Diana Mara Henry, an award-winning photographer, historian, and now the author of a remarkable new book, which I have here, my own personal copy, I Am Andre, which tells the almost unbelievable true story of Andre Joseph Scheinmann, a German Jewish refugee who became a French resistance fighter, a British spy, a concentration camp inmate, and a man whose courage kept pushing him into danger when most people would have run the other way. His life touches so many themes that resonate deeply with us as Jews today: survival, moral clarity, identity, and the relentless fight for and on behalf of our people. Diana Mara Henry is a former photojournalist whose work has been featured in the National Women's Hall of Fame, the New York State Museum, the Schlesinger Library at Harvard, and the New York Public Library, among many other places. Since 1985, she has become a leading scholar of the Natzweiler concentration camp, which I'm sure we'll talk more about, presenting her research everywhere from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem to the Genocide Studies program of Yale University to the 9/11 Memorial and Museum, and many more. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Diana Mara Henry to Sinai Temple and to Sinai Speaks. Diana, it is such a privilege to have you here.
Thank you. It's great to be here with you.
I'm so excited to get into our conversation, and I thought maybe we would start with this question without spilling all of the details. Diana, can you give us a summary of Andre's life? I know it's a big question, but maybe just the high points of Andre's life before, during, and after the Second World War.
Okay, well, Andre was born in Munich, which he found to be ironic considering that he ended up for some months in Dachau before the end of the war. And because Munich was in some ways the headquarters of the Nazi Party.
Right.
And his father and mother were from Galicia originally, from Poland. Or so they were also immigrants to Germany, and his father established shoe stores throughout Germany, and also fought for Germany in World War I. But as soon as Hitler came to create his putsch, try to take over the German government and country in 1923-24, Andre's father started to speak out against Hitler. So he had Andre had a role model of his father's resistance and activism.
Yeah.
Andre called his father Max a militant. So when Hitler came to power in 1933, Max moved his family to France. He had already gotten visas for the family in 1924. So 9 years ahead of Hitler's coming to power, he already had established an exit route for Hitler. And from there, Andre joined the French army. He and his dad gave up their citizenship in 1939. And Andre fought for France. But the French resistance to the German army was very short-lived. So in about 2 months, Andre was imprisoned in a prisoner of war camp by the Germans and escaped via forgery. And it was sort of his first act of daring do and impostorship. And he became a translator for the head of the French National Railroads in Brittany. He refused to work for the Germans, but when he was offered the job and he made sure that he was actually working for the French, although the Germans were using the French railroads.
Right.
He was in an extremely important position to be able to gather intelligence about how the Germans, were using the railroads, where their bases were, where their fuel depots were, how they were moving troops around, how they were moving raw materials around, what air bases they were creating, and so on. So he became a very trusted associate, not only for his boss, but also the Germans really appreciated his use of the language and his catering to their needs for organization and clarity, as they thought they were getting. And so he accompanied them on some very very critical confidential missions of the high command, the German high command, to visit their U-boat bases, and their fuel depots and so on. So without without them knowing that he was German originally, they thought he was just a PhD student in Germany, and that he had excellent German because he'd studied German for so many years. He was able to create and to unite networks of the French resistance that were really under the domination and support of the British Secret Service. The British were really funding and supporting the resistance throughout Europe. And at least for the first 2 years, the British were preeminent in supporting the French resistance as well. Mm-hmm. So eventually, in January of 1942, he started in his role at the French railroads in 1940, in September of 40. And by January 42, he was en route to London, brought over by the British to be entrusted with 2 new missions. And he was sent back in February of 42 by MI6 with 500,000 French francs to start 2 new missions. But the networks that he had been working with for the past year and a half were one by one were betrayed. And finally, on his return to France, he was arrested, and a lot of people in his network, they had been betrayed for the final blow while they were in London. So then began his odyssey through the Gestapo prisons in Paris for 18 months, and then through the concentration camps.
And this is, just to clarify, this is without anyone knowing he's Jewish.
Right. No one knew he was Jewish, and no one knew he was German. I've talked to some people who I think are familiar with MI6 without them giving me the details, and they say, oh, for sure MI6 knew he was German and a Jew, but I'm not sure. We won't know, at least for the foreseeable future, because MI6 has not released any of its files.
Wow.
But when he was in the camp, and if he was ever questioned about his circumcision, he would tell the Germans, oh, don't you know all the best French families circumcised? So he had a way with the Germans because he was German. Sure. And he knew that they were always in a top dog, underdog, rationale. So, if you didn't dominate them, they would dominate you. So he was very, domineering with them, even as a prisoner in the camps. And so, don't you know, the best French families circumcise their children. And actually, one of the other people I talked to at Natzweiler, who was a Jew, Andre never volunteered to me about his circumcision, but this man, when I first met him at the camp, he as soon as we sat down for an interview, he said to me, "You probably want to know about my circumcision." Yeah. And it was like, I was like, yes, certainly. So, he said that he was sure he was doomed because when they first arrived at the camp and they were lined up naked, walking in front of the SS to be interviewed and
Right.
processed and so on. He was sure he was doomed because of his circumcision. And then he said he looked to the right, and there was Prince Xavier of Bourbon Parme, the heir to the French throne, who was circumcised.
Oh my.
And then
So it was true.
he looked to the left, and there was the Archbishop of Clermont-Ferrand, Monsignor Piguet, who was circumcised. So it was true. Andre was. I mean, Andre was. He was honest and as far as it possible, because there was nothing to be lost by being, you know, by telling it like it was and by being authentic as much as possible. And anyway, he saw things very clearly. And so that my friend and Gilbert May, who I was talking to at this first meeting, he said to the archbishop and to the prince, can I walk between you as we go down the line? Because he knew that the Germans would be much more interested in the archbishop and in the Prince of Bourbon Parme than they would be in plain old Gilbert May.
Right.
So that's how he survived his first interview. But yeah,
And
so
yeah,
no,
yeah.
it wasn't
And
known.
maybe you can speak more about Andre's experience in the camp and how he survived.
Well, Andre survived. He never downplayed luck as a factor, but he, as I think it's Primo Levi said, two factors help people coming into the camp. One was any camp. One was to be in good health, and the other was to speak German.
Mm.
Andre was ended up as a translator for the French, who were sort of segregated into one barrack at Notzweiler. And he was, on when they first were lined up, the commandant of the camp was there, and he said, "Now, which one of you is a translator?" And Andre didn't step forward. He said it was never good to volunteer for anything. So he wasn't stepping forward. And the commandant said, "Well, if this person doesn't step forward, I'm going to shoot 5 of you."
Oh my.
So Andre's buddies pushed him and said, "You gotta step out there, pal." So he became a translator. It doesn't mean that he avoided the torments and the tortures, and actually other survivors of the camp record how often he would distract the Germans when they were on a vengeful, in a paroxysm of rage and sadistic orgy. He would often take it upon himself to distract them by speaking to them in German, and sometimes getting the boot in the behind, as one of them says. But but in general, it was helpful to know what the Germans wanted and to be able to execute immediately, even if it meant just taking your cap off when they ordered you to, because obedience was prized to such an extent that it could save your life if you could follow orders. So he helped his comrades by telling them what was expected of them, by making sure they knew that it was really important that even in the slightest detail that the crazy world of the concentration camp become their world, and that the rules become, no matter what they thought of them, that it would be life-saving if they could follow. what was expected of them.
Right.
And often he would, they all became sort of masters of slow walking. And yeah, he created theatrical performances, and
Right.
he did he did care and try to work, for the morale of his buddies, comrades. And
Deeply so, yeah.
he protected some of the Jews in the camp. They didn't know that he was Jewish. They didn't know, they couldn't understand why they were being protected, or why he was treating them so well. But he did try especially to help the Jews who were there.
Right, right. And there's so much more to his story that we could talk about, and that we will, and that readers can find out more about. But I wonder, for you, Diana, what drew you to Andre's story, and what brought you to write this book about him? It's more than just a book. It's a portrait of his life, and the lives of those who accompanied him throughout his journey. What drew you to this story?
Well, the actually, it's a college connection. I had been studying the Camp Natzweiler for about 10 years before I met Andre. And I was at Harvard, and for all our big reunions, we have a reunion book where we can write, what we've been doing. And so I wrote, I've been studying the Camp Natzweiler. And Andre's son got in touch with me, and he said, I think you'd like to meet my father, who was a camper at Knoxville. And I have not heard of being a camper at a concentration camp, but I would very much, I was trying to meet the survivors because we were, it was the 90s, 1990s. So quite a few of them were passing away.
Mhm.
So I met Andre, and he said he wanted to self-publish his memoir for his family. And I said, this is a fantastic story. I'm sure a publisher would want to publish it. So, little knowing that I'd work on it for 30 years before this actually happened. But yeah. So I worked with him on the memoir part of it, which is the first part of the book, which is
Mhm.
what he wrote. And I edited that, and that was the first until he passed away in 2001. So that was maybe the first 7 years I had the book. And then all the archives opened, and the war records in France and Great Britain became available. And then I found the books that mentioned him by survivors of the camp, and it was a fascinating process, culminating in 2018 by his son telling me that he had found a box of his dad's papers.
Mm.
And, but of course, they're in French, he said. And it's like, well, Michelle, I speak French,
Oh,
remember. So anyway, I raced down to Boston and got this box, which was about 250 pages of
mm.
his archive from during the war, his translator pass, his little black book with his English handlers' addresses and phone numbers. None of this had been found on him. Nothing was ever found on him when he was,
Mm.
including the treasure that the British had given him to start the networks. So he was able to hide that too and return it to them after the war. So yeah, so that was really the second part of the book is really everything he did not tell
Right.
that I was able to describe.
And not
Yeah,
just describe, but present, and all many of those documents
yeah,
are
a lot of
are
images.
portrayed here.
Yeah, there's a lot of images, a lot of letters from his friends or from his agents who became friends, and very touching, very touching tributes and humorous tributes too, in some ways, to
Yes.
how they all protected each other, and all elements of society, from from the woman who kept house for her sister so that her sister could hide British flyers, to countesses who made towers available to to fleeing partisans, to it's just it's a real cross section of French society, because he wasn't a member of the Jewish resistance, which was very great in France. But this was really a French groups that had sprung up right after the occupation. Very early resistance. It's not what we think of as the Maquis. It's not 1943, 1944. This is the earliest resistance.
Right, right. On that point that you're mentioning, Diana, what I found so interesting about Andre's story in particular is that it sits at the intersection of so many identities, right? He was German, but he emigrated to France. He became a resistance fighter. He was also a Holocaust survivor. I wonder how he understood his Jewishness, his identity as a Jew in relation to the other parts of himself. Um, Maybe you can give us some insight into that, and how his understanding of himself as a Jew impacted the choices he made.
Yeah, that's a very a very complex question. I think that even the question of him as a Holocaust survivor is an interesting question,
Please.
because he was not, he didn't undergo the war as a Jew. So in a sense, his story is a story of the resistance, but not necessarily, his fate was not the fate of a Jew.
Hmm.
And part of the story, though, of the book is his loss of his parents,
Yeah.
who were rounded up by the French police in July 1942 in the huge Hafer du Veldiv, and sent to Germany and perished in Auschwitz.
Mm.
So it is a Holocaust story, certainly for them. And for him, I mean, the story is, in a way, it's a story of his personal victory over the Germans.
Right.
But his greatest defeat, and I think I mean, I know it never left him, his sense of loss and defeat, that he wasn't able to save his parents.
Mhm.
So that was his tragedy in the war, which is definitely a Holocaust tragedy. Of course, there's the whole question of whether the Holocaust was just a Jewish tragedy, or whether it wasn't a tremendous tragedy and stain on all the people
Hmm.
in Europe. So
Absolutely.
it's not just a Jewish tragedy. I mean, anti-Semitism never is just about the Jews.
Yeah. And we'll get to that. And
Yeah,
you
yeah,
bring up what's so unique about Andre's story is that it's not the typical story of a Jew in the Holocaust,
yeah,
right? It's uh,
yeah.
he is not the norm, and you describe him, or he describes himself as someone who took risks far beyond what anyone would expect of a single individual, and I mean especially a Jew at that time. What what drove his courage and determination?
Well, it started very early, and really it started with his Jewish identity. When as a school, a teenager in school, he saw that his Jewish classmates were being suppressed and isolated, and very much. I mean, there's something in it. It's sort of unfortunately kind of connects with what the Jewish experience today in
Mm.
a lot of colleges. And he wanted to create self-support groups for those classmates and young people.
Right.
And so that was his beginning. And I think his Jewish core was always, his Jewish values. And he also talks about bourgeois values were always very central. But I think he had the example of his father as a
Right. You mentioned.
sister and the courage to speak out. Uh, I think he I think he had his father's example as planning for the reality. I think Andre, one of the gifts that he gave me was a sense that one can't escape reality, and that
Mm.
it's a sort of a preeminent importance to accept the reality as it is and not to rely on wishful thinking. That if one didn't take steps to address, to see things clearly and to address reality, one would be lost.
Mm.
And so you were talking about taking risks. I don't think that Andre, I don't think he felt there was a choice. There was only a choice of how much one could resist and how much one could push, you know, uh, the steps that one took, not just for oneself, but for others. I mean,
Right.
its action for the youth in Dusseldorf was for hundreds of young people. And, in the camps, he, equally tried to shelter and protect others. And he definitely was extremely conscientious as a resistor in not being found with documentation or the names of agents, and which a lot of people were found with, and doomed others. So but I think basically his risk taking also had to do with the fact that he was young. He was a young unattached man in his mid-20s. And this was really the prime of life, and the time when his circumstances allowed him to, unfettered by marriage and family, except for his parents, to really act, um, to act. And he even had the strength of character to jettison girlfriends who
Right.
who wanted to draft him into their, student resistor groups. You remember that part of the book
I
where,
do very well.
this young, and he says she was a young Jewish student at the university, and she wanted him to join her student resistor group, and he said, "No, I have a very important job. I can't. You know, I can't. Um, I can't risk my job, at the railroads, my bureaucrat position, And of course, he was just trying to protect her
Right.
because, he didn't, I mean, he probably actually was, his network of groups probably did include her student association group, but he wasn't going to, ensnare her in knowing about what he was doing. And she dropped him. And, this was a strength of character. I think the risk, also was a strength of character that he was able to manage, manage his circumstances.
Yeah, he demonstrates both idealism on the one hand, as you mentioned, but also a deep sense of principle and practicality
Right.
at the
Realistic.
same time.
And I think that you were asking what he meant to me personally. I think this, meeting him came at a very difficult time in my life. My marriage was breaking up, and how to protect my daughter and so on. And I wish that I'd met him earlier, because, I was still in this sort of vapid, kind of everyone's good at heart, kind of Anne Frank, kind of, it's pathetic,
Mhm.
wishy-washy, the lawyer will defend me.
Yeah.
So, and no, if you don't, I mean, what he was able to impart to me was that you have to see things clearly for what they are, not wishful thinking.
Yes.
And if you don't act for yourself, you know, it's not going to happen.
Right, right. That sense of initiative, of independence, while also being very conscious of others, as you mentioned, and that brings me to my next question, which is, um, as a resistance fighter, right, a French resistance fighter, also a British spy, and secretly a Jew, Andre had to maintain alliances and balance multiple loyalties, almost mind-bogglingly so. Um, of course, since the founding of the State of Israel, and increasingly so today, unfortunately, Jews have been accused of dual loyalty. Uh, and at the same time, October 7th showed us that some of the allies we in the Jewish community thought that we could count on weren't as reliable as they seemed. I wonder what Andre's life can teach us about loyalty and allyship as Jews.
Well, yeah, Andre was a man without a country.
Mm,
He turned in his German passport, before the war, and he fought for the French without being a French citizen, and I think he was. I heard it said recently that the Jews are a people, and that other peoples aren't peoples. They're citizens. And so I think he felt, that really his parents having left Poland because of the pogroms, and then they're having left Germany, they're really because of Hitler and the French collapse of, the collaboration that ensued from a country that they had put so much hope in as a bastion of liberty and fraternity, and
mhm,
where Jews were very prominent in the French government before the war, and then they turned on their Jews and turned them in and rounded them up. And I don't think there was any illusion, for him that there was anything but, a Jewish identity.
mm,
That, and that he believed that freedom was a human value, that for the sake of everyone in society, not just the Jews, that there should be freedom. But that, one, I think his alliances really were the alliances with the people that he felt could best support freedom,
mm,
and whatever state it was. I think that's why he went with Churchill. When he got off the boat in England, when they buried him across the channel at night, and they de Gaulle wanted him to come with the Free French, and he said, no, 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 I'm going with Churchill. So I think he just, his goal was to try to work with that culture and that, political power that could best support freedom for everyone. I mean, he says not just for the Jews, but for society. He felt that it was the primary social good, and that,
right.
you know he so I don't know if that answers your question, but
Oh, absolutely.
I,
Absolutely. Alliance of principle, right? And loyalty to peoplehood.
yeah, and I think, today, as far as today goes, I don't know where he would look today. uh I was thinking about this challenge of your yours, where in the world are people protecting, not just the Jews, but the values
Hmm.
that come in a society that where the Jews are allowed to be themselves.
Right.
And we're such a tiny speck of the world. And yet, so much is focused on us that it seems clear that all the others in the world have chosen to define themselves by, their relationship with us.
Mm.
So based on that, how are people defining themselves today? And I don't know what he would suggest, but I know that, he didn't think that people could really, national identities could change that much.
Mm.
He didn't, he would never sit on a dais with a German. And he, at a time when a lot of the resistance in the countries and Europe in general after the war really turned toward, the greater European community, and the UN was, the world government, was a lot of people were already thinking this was a great thing, and we should, that nationalism was a peril. That was not Andre, and
Mm.
not all resistance, not all people who came through after survived the camps thought that, but there were, that was the beginning of a lot of international, world order ideals, and that was not Andre's
Mm.
idea.
Right.
No,
He had no illusions.
no, he realized that, countries do make choices. And I guess the idea that the whole world would be united against the Jews that's not something that was his experience.
Right. Well,
And
I was particularly struck by a certain paragraph in the book. It's actually on page 160 where Andre writes this. What happened to us, meaning Jews, happened in an ordinary time. The Nazis could only accomplish what they did, first in Germany and later in all the occupied territories, thanks to a lot of complicity in high-ranking places, and also thanks to the indifference, lack of courage, ignorance, and will not to believe what seemed to be the incredible acts of the Germans. That stood out to me so much because your book arrives at a time when Jewish communities are unfortunately once again grappling with rising anti-Semitism worldwide. I wonder what can Jewish readers take from Andre's example today, given what we're facing in our world?
well, I think that paragraph that you picked out, there was also one that I was thinking, I might read, so I'm thrilled that you
Please,
said it.
please.
No, it combines a lot of his thoughts, including, the idea that people don't want to recognize, what what is happening around them. So, not to sacrifice to your, wishful thinking, not to don't sacrifice, your own perceptions of, what's actually happening. Uh, so the fact that, that if you um, if you see someone coming to kill you, you know, maybe you don't have to kill him first, but you definitely do have to acknowledge that if he wrote it in the book, like he wrote in Mein Kampf, if he said, he's that's part of the the goal here, to kill the Jews or to isolate them or to put us in ghettos. Are American Jews going to become ghettoized again? Are we going to, have, retreat to our own, schools and communities and so on? Where are we going to go given what's actually happening? and what is being announced as a program. The mayor of New York has a program, and he's announced it. And the actions to isolate Israel, are definitely, maybe half of that program. So, where are you going to go? I think it's important to consider,
Mm.
where that is. What would Andre say? I don't know. I was thinking of, would he say Israel? I mean, where is the survival of the Jewish people? Uh, where is that paramount today?
Right. We would say Israel, and I don't know if Andre had any relationship with Israel in his life after the war. We haven't spoken so much about his life after the war, but maybe now would be a good time. I mean, many in our community have the experience of having to leave their country of origin and relocate and reinvent themselves in a new place. Maybe you can speak to more of Andre's experience after the war and how he had to pick up his life and reinvent himself.
Yeah, I think that he reinvented himself during the war. That was, extremely creative, and his illusionist, his great uncles who were illusionists, I think helped him to do that in some way. I mean, I think if there's a gene for for illusionism, Andre definitely got that gene, because he was able to create this persona of, the gray bureaucrat that was definitely not the risk taker and absolutely dazzling, um, intelligence professional that he was during the war. But and I love it if you like imposter stories, which I think this is a great, imposter story. So as far as reinventing himself, I think that the process he went through after the war was really more of returning to
Ah.
who he was before the war, and
Mm.
who his parents were. And so, although I think that he might have wanted to continue in intelligence with either the British or the American, um, I think his taking back his Jewish identity
Mm.
or really was a handicap in terms of how acceptable he was to the intelligence community in that role. And so he became again what he had been before the war, what his parents, he had been training and interning at. I couldn't put everything in the book, but he was sent to a large text clothing company to intern for a few months before the war, while his parents had reestablished a couple of stores in northern France, and he was in charge of one of them, which was a specialty was tennis and ping pong and
Mm.
racket sports, because he was a tremendous tennis fanatic. So he joined a tennis club and so on. So after the war, he came to the United States, and I think his European hopes being dashed to some extent. It was very hard in France after the war. And he came to the United States and opened a store in New Bedford that was very successful. I think it was called Baby Town.
Mm.
And, he sold baby furniture and supplies and so on, and played tennis. His sister played tennis. And, so he became again after the war, I think, what he had been before the war. And um, and just, you know, he said, I'm not involved in politics, but I'm very grateful to be in a country where people live freely.
Mm. I love that. So he it was actually a returning to his self, having worn so many masks and adopted so many identities, he could return to his authentic self in a way.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Um, I was just reading this morning, Diana. There's an article on the front page of I think it was JTA, Jewish Telegraphic Agency, at least at the time of this recording that we're doing, about several prominent Holocaust survivors who've recently passed, including maybe you heard the last known resistance fighter in the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. Um, you've given us such a gift in documenting Andre's story, but I wonder what, if anything, you think, being the documentarian you are, will change once those like Andre are no longer around to tell their own stories. How do we keep their memories alive?
Well, I think the second and third generation are going to do it. I think there's every single person has such a story to tell. And now that the finally the French and British National Archives are open, so the archives previously survivors could only tell their story as a memory.
Mhm,
Now I think this book, I think my book, um, is part of a new generation of survivor stories,
mm,
as it's going to be able to rely not only on the words and memories of the survivors, but on the documentation
mhm,
of their existence. So I think that it's really not at an end. It's at the beginning of a new phase
mm,
where we the research capabilities are so much greater now that we're going to be able to enhance what we know about these people. And if AI doesn't take over and completely, I belong to a special operations executive news group, and there's a whole question about what AI is going to do to the writing of these stories. But if we
mm,
can maintain human agency and actually keep in touch, keep keep the documentation foremost. I mean, I have a relative who is pursued for 30 years the uh, expropriation of her parents' properties in Berlin, and finally got them back. I don't think the story's not over.
mm.
There's still a tremendous amount of inspiration that I think people in my generation and your generation are going to be seeking.
Yeah.
And these people aren't forgotten. There's a very touching introduction to one of the books that I have, many hundreds of books, but someone going to Bergen-Belsen and saying that they want to see the grave of Anne Frank. And the caretaker sort of points to the cemetery with thousands of graves and says they're all Anne Frank.
Mm.
So each of these people can be needs to be honored, and uh, I think it's just like if we survive as human beings and the concept of actual human beings can still be honored in the future, that the people we've lost will still contribute so much to our lives. So
Amen.
yeah.
Amen. As you've done with Andre's story and bringing it to light for us. You've mentioned what about Andre's life and story is most personally meaningful to you, but what do you hope that readers will most take away from your book and his story?
It's that's the part that I want to hear from the readers.
Okay.
Because everyone has a different idea of it. They have an idea of well, one woman loves to read the index over and over. It's like, who knew, and someone else,
It's very comprehensive, by the way.
someone else, well, Andre wanted the story to be published. He said, he begged me on his last time I saw him, which was practically on his deathbed. He said, I want this story to be published for my comrades.
Mm.
So I think he knew that even as being preeminent as he was in the resistance, and as unknown as he was, that when his story became better known, that all the people around him who were even less well known than he, would also be honored by its telling. So that's why the footnotes are so extensive and so on, is because there are all these other stories in there,
Yes.
a lot of other people. And I think, I think they're all, I mean, it's really, they're all to be honored. So I think it's not just him, but that it makes a difference no matter what role you play. Like his closest associate after the war, for 5 years he worked longer for the resistance after the war than he did during the war, because he inscribed his agents, hundreds of his agents, into French government archives, so that they could receive pensions and
Mm-hmm.
honors. And the woman who helped him the most with this task, her sister, um, kept house for her so that she could rescue pilots and escaping British airmen who had been shot down. And when the woman and her sister both were in concentration camps for 3 years during the war. But after the war, when her sister wrote her testimony, which I include in the book, her sister said, I kept house because it was difficult. It was difficult for Christine to, manage all the different escaping people and also keep house for them and cook for them. So I cooked for them and kept house. And then after 3 years in concentration camp and so on, she writes in her, documentation, she says, I only wish I could have done more.
Mm.
So there's incredible courage wherever you are, wherever you are placed, you have a role to play. I mean, to me, I think that's really an important part of the story too, is that all these people played a role, and we can be proud of them and proud of humanity.
Mm.
It's not just, it's not just the story of the Nazis. It's also, or the collaboration. It's also the story of every honorable person who stepped up to do something.
Yes, absolutely. And it's not just Andre's story, it's the story of all who were involved with him. And as you say, so many individual acts of incredible courage and principle. And God willing, all of their stories will be written just as you've written Andre's story and brought it to us. Thank you, Diana, for this really meaningful and moving conversation about a true hero and thankfully now not a little known hero in our people's recent past, whose remarkable story we all ought to know. We can learn more about it in Diana's book. Once again, I am Andre. This is my personal copy. You can see it's flagged and marked up really well. It's available on Amazon, I believe, as well as I'm sure many other booksellers, and at iamandre.live. Did I get that right, Diana? iamandre.live, where you can find out much more about the book, about Andre's story, and you can also contact Diana directly. May Andre's story and Diana, your dedication in preserving it, remind us both of the responsibility, I would say, and the privilege we share as Jews for one another, as Andre demonstrates in spades, Diana, thank you so much. I've learned so much from your book and even more from you and speaking with you. Um, we're so grateful for the time, for your giving us your time at Sinai Temple. We will see you all next time at our next installment of Sinai Speaks, and we so appreciate you joining us. Diana, thank you. I think we're going to have to conclude it there, but really we could have gone so much longer because there's so much more to talk about in Andre's story.